A fast-moving object the size of Manhattan is hurtling towards our solar system, and it will make its closest pass to Earth.
Astronomers tracking 3I Atlas say it has altered its course, worrying scientists about its close proximity to Earth.
The United States Navy has begun signaling a shift in tone about a matter that has already stirred a considerable amount of attention across military, intelligence, and strategic circles. Reports from within the service indicate that high-ranking officials now believe the enigmatic entity designated as 3I Atlas may be preparing for arrival far earlier than originally projected. This adjustment in expectation is not a minor recalibration of scheduling or prediction. Rather, it marks a fundamental alteration in how the Navy is framing its readiness, its allocation of assets, and its interpretation of what 3I Atlas represents. When an institution as large and as deliberate as the Navy begins to speak in terms of imminent arrival, it suggests that the intelligence community has received compelling indications, whether from observation, intercepted signals, or pattern recognition, that the timeline has accelerated. That shift alone has rippling consequences across the geopolitical, scientific, and defense landscapes. Before we start, smash the like and subscribe buttons for more updates. At the heart of this development is the sense of compressed time. For months, if not years, analysts had maintained that 3I Atlas was a distant prospect, something to be studied, monitored, and prepared for in a deliberate manner. That framework gave strategists breathing room, the ability to test contingencies without a clock ticking too loudly in the background. Now, however, the Navy's recalibration implies that the horizon has shortened. It means that resources must be marshaled sooner, that ships must be repositioned, that crews must be briefed with urgency, and that the scientific community tied into naval intelligence must begin producing practical assessments rather than theoretical models. Time has suddenly become the scarce commodity. The Navy's emphasis on earlier arrival speaks to the underlying uncertainty of dealing with phenomena that do not fit comfortably into existing categories. 3I Atlas has never been described in the language of conventional adversaries or ordinary weapon systems. It is spoken of as something vast, coordinated, and possessing a presence that compels militaries to rethink the boundaries of their doctrines. When naval intelligence updates its arrival expectations, it is not doing so because of an incremental shift in satellite imagery alone, but because the aggregate of observations and classified signals has tipped the balance toward a new conclusion: that the entity is moving, aligning, or otherwise preparing to manifest in a way that compresses the strategic clock. The announcement carries weight because of who is making it. The Navy is not a single voice. It is a network of commands, fleets, and specialized intelligence branches that rarely speak in unison unless compelled by evidence. For such an institution to conclude that 3I Atlas is approaching earlier than expected, the inputs must be converging across domains: undersea sensors, orbital assets, encrypted communications intercepts, and classified technical instruments. This convergence lends credibility to what might otherwise be dismissed as speculation. In a community that lives and breathes verification, multiple sources are the lifeblood of certainty. That certainty, once crystallized, becomes a directive for action. The implications extend beyond military logistics. If 3I Atlas is indeed preparing for arrival, the scientific community must confront questions of origin, scale, and intent with new urgency. Astronomers, astrophysicists, and aerospace engineers who may have been content to theorize in academic circles are now being pulled into the gravitational field of defense planning. The Navy's recalibration places them on the clock as well, demanding answers that are not only elegant in theory, but also practical in terms of prediction. For science, this acceleration is both an opportunity and a challenge. The chance to observe a phenomenon of immense magnitude, but under the pressure of military timelines and national security priorities. For the rank-and-file sailor, the announcement creates a different texture of reality. Sailors are accustomed to deployments, exercises, and strategic posturing. What they are less accustomed to is the sense that they may be participating in an unfolding encounter with an entity that defies precedent. Rumors spread quickly through mess decks and wardrooms, and the idea that 3I Atlas is accelerating its approach transforms idle speculation into serious concern. For many, the notion of being on the front line of such an event is both sobering and electrifying. The Navy thrives on readiness, but readiness takes on a new meaning when the unknown itself is drawing nearer. Strategically, the recalibration forces the Pentagon and allied nations to rethink deployment patterns. Fleets that might have been scheduled for routine exercises must now be considered for rapid redeployment. Intelligence sharing with allies becomes even more critical, as any piece of data related to 3I Atlas could provide the key to understanding its trajectory. The Navy's recognition of earlier arrivals signals to NATO partners, Pacific allies, and other strategic partners that the clock is ticking faster and that coordination must happen now rather than later. This sense of urgency strengthens bonds, but it also places immense pressure on decision-makers to balance secrecy with collaboration. The psychological dimension cannot be overstated. To acknowledge that 3I Atlas may be arriving sooner is to trigger waves of speculation among civilian populations, political leaders, and defense analysts alike. People begin to ask what arrival means. Will it be a visible manifestation in Earth's atmosphere, a signal that shakes global communications, or a presence that becomes undeniable across continents? Each possibility carries its own implications for public order, governance, and global stability. While the Navy itself may not be in the business of public reassurance, its shift in tone inevitably filters into the broader consciousness, creating a narrative of imminence that governments must grapple with. Inside the Pentagon, the acceleration of 3I Atlas timelines compels contingency planning at every level. Emergency protocols that might once have been hypothetical are now being refined, tested, and prepared for real-world activation. Civil defense authorities are likely being briefed in classified settings, and the intersection between military planning and civilian preparedness grows sharper. The Navy's recalibration may have started as a technical update, but in practice it reverberates across every arm of the government that would be mobilized in the event of arrival. The machinery of the state begins to hum with a different rhythm. The role of technology in this shift deserves attention. It is entirely plausible that new sensor technologies, perhaps deployed on submarines or advanced drones, detected anomalies that contradicted earlier estimates. If 3I Atlas has been accelerating, adjusting its trajectory, or otherwise changing its profile, only the most sensitive instruments would pick this up. The Navy, long a pioneer in undersea and orbital surveillance, may now be leaning on technologies that were classified until recently, leveraging them to provide a clearer picture of the entity's movement. This infusion of new data streams could explain why the recalibration happened suddenly, as breakthroughs often emerge in bursts rather than gradual trickles. From a geopolitical standpoint, the timing of this revelation is critical. Rivals of the United States will be scrutinizing the Navy's language for clues about vulnerability, intent, and readiness. Nations such as China and Russia, with their own advanced militaries, may interpret the announcement as either a genuine warning or as strategic messaging. In either case, it forces adversaries to allocate their own resources, consider their own contingency plans, and possibly accelerate their own programs related to monitoring or preparing for 3I Atlas. Thus, the Navy's recalibration is not just an internal matter. It is a message that reshapes the calculations of every major power. At the same time, the acceleration complicates the work of policymakers who must walk a tightrope between transparency and secrecy. Too much openness could create public panic or destabilize markets, while too much secrecy risks losing control of the narrative as leaks and rumors fill the void. The Navy's recalibration places civilian leadership in a bind. They must acknowledge the shift without creating chaos, a delicate balancing act that becomes harder as the sense of imminence grows. Political leaders will now be judged not only on their response to events, but also on their ability to manage expectations. The religious and cultural dimensions also loom large. The idea of an arrival, particularly of something vast and beyond conventional human understanding, has always carried spiritual weight. For some, the acceleration of 3I Atlas's timeline may be interpreted as confirmation of long-held beliefs or prophecies. For others, it may be a source of existential dread. The Navy may operate in the language of strategy and logistics, but the broader society processes such revelations through lenses of meaning, faith, and myth. Thus, the recalibration does not only trigger technical responses, it stirs the deeper currents of human imagination and fear. For the sailors deployed at sea, the sense of imminence may heighten vigilance to a degree not seen in decades. The Navy has long drilled its crews for encounters with the unexpected, from hostile submarines to natural disasters. Yet 3I Atlas represents something outside that spectrum. To prepare for its arrival means cultivating a mindset where every radar ping, every sonar return, and every atmospheric anomaly is treated with heightened scrutiny. The operational tempo increases, the nights grow longer, and the sense of living through a historic moment begins to permeate every aspect of service life. The recalibration also alters the tempo of scientific collaboration. Civilian researchers who once worked on open projects may now find themselves recruited into classified environments where their expertise can be applied to pressing questions about 3I Atlas. This blending of civilian science and military urgency creates tensions. On one hand, it accelerates discovery, but on the other, it constrains the flow of knowledge. The Navy's recalibration essentially pulls the scientific community into the orbit of national security, where timelines are dictated not by academic journals, but by the imperatives of readiness. The acceleration raises questions about whether humanity has underestimated the nature of 3I Atlas itself. If it is arriving sooner than expected, does that imply it is more dynamic, more adaptive, or more aware than analysts originally assumed? This line of questioning pushes into the philosophical as much as the strategic. To treat 3I Atlas as a static object would be comforting. To recognize it as something capable of shifting timelines is profoundly unsettling. The Navy's recalibration is therefore not only about logistics, but about a recognition that the entity itself may be more complex than previously believed. Within wargaming simulations and classified briefings, the acceleration changes everything. Scenarios that were once run on the assumption of a distant horizon must now be condensed, tested, and refined under pressure. Commanders must weigh options with less room for error, and decision trees must be pruned to account for the speed of unfolding events. Wargaming, a staple of naval planning, becomes less about exploring distant hypotheticals and more about preparing for imminent encounters. The pace of rehearsal matches the pace of the clock. The financial implications, while less obvious, are equally profound. Defense contractors already engaged in projects tangentially related to 3I Atlas may now find themselves under pressure to deliver prototypes, systems, or capabilities ahead of schedule. Budgets may be shifted, contracts expedited, and entire industries pulled into a wartime footing without the declaration of war. The Navy's recalibration cascades down into the economy, reshaping priorities and channeling resources into projects deemed critical for readiness. Even the diplomatic arena is reshaped. Nations that may have been skeptical about 3I Atlas now face a choice: align with the U.S. assessment or risk being left unprepared. The Navy's recalibration acts as both a warning and an invitation, urging partners to take the timeline seriously. For those who accept, it strengthens alliances. For those who hesitate, it risks creating fractures in the global response. Diplomacy, like defense, is suddenly operating under compressed timelines. The cultural impact also deserves reflection. Films, literature, and media that have long speculated about encounters with the unknown suddenly find themselves resonating with reality. The Navy's recalibration does not merely shift strategy, it fuels the imagination of millions who consume stories of arrival and contact. The line between fiction and reality blurs, and societies begin to rehearse in their imaginations what it might mean to live through the arrival of 3I Atlas. That cultural rehearsal, while intangible, plays a role in shaping how populations respond when events become undeniable. For intelligence analysts, the recalibration intensifies the burden of interpretation. Every signal, every anomaly, and every unexplained event must now be viewed through the lens of accelerated timelines. The margin for error narrows, and the consequences of misinterpretation grow. Analysts who once had the luxury of debate now work under the pressure of immediacy. The Navy's recalibration places them in a crucible where every judgment matters. The training of sailors and officers is also being transformed. Traditional curriculums focused on conventional warfare and navigation must now integrate modules on the unknown. Briefings that once covered hostile fleets now include discussions of phenomena that defy categorization. This expansion of the training envelope reflects the reality that the Navy's recalibration is not just about ships and deployments, but about preparing human minds for encounters outside the bounds of prior experience. The acceleration also alters the rhythm of intelligence dissemination. Classified updates that may have been issued weekly or monthly are now flowing daily, even hourly. Decision makers require constant updates, and the intelligence apparatus must deliver without pause. The Navy's recalibration turns the intelligence cycle into a relentless stream, reflecting the urgency of a clock that no longer offers comfort. Public perception, while shaped by secrecy, will inevitably be affected. As whispers of earlier arrivals seep into the media, people will begin to adjust their own expectations of the future. The sense of living in an ordinary time gives way to the sense of living in a threshold moment. The Navy's recalibration, though a technical matter in one sense, reshapes the psychology of entire societies that sense something unprecedented is near. The Navy's acknowledgement that 3I Atlas is preparing for earlier arrival crystallizes a transformation already underway. It marks the point where speculation turns into planning, where distance turns into imminence, and where the vast unknown begins to cast a tangible shadow across the known. In that shift, the boundaries of science, defense, politics, and culture are redrawn. The clock has accelerated, and with it, so has the urgency of human imagination and response. The shift in assessment by the United States Navy regarding the timeline of 3I Atlas has created a new atmosphere of expectation and unease. When an institution of such weight and authority places emphasis on earlier arrival, the implications extend into every corner of society. What makes this moment even more distinctive is the way it forces humanity to confront a future that was thought to be distant but is now pressing against the present. The recalibration of time means more than simply adjusting charts and schedules. It changes the psychological horizon of billions, altering how governments, militaries, and civilians alike interpret what is unfolding around them. The Navy's message conveys urgency, but it also introduces a new complexity into how the phenomenon is to be interpreted. The earlier timeline suggests not only that 3I Atlas is on course, but that its movement may be deliberate, intentional, or at least governed by dynamics far more intricate than originally assumed. If its motion can change in ways that compress the expected window of arrival, then the assumptions underpinning earlier models may require a full-scale rethinking. This brings to light questions about intelligence, capability, and adaptability on the part of the entity itself, which challenges human understanding at the deepest levels. One of the most immediate consequences of this reassessment is its impact on naval doctrine. The Navy, with its global presence, must be ready to respond in multiple theaters at once. Yet now, the nature of its mission is less about deterring rival fleets or projecting power across contested waters, and more about maintaining an adaptable posture for an encounter with something wholly outside of traditional adversarial categories. This requires reorienting training, updating tactical manuals, and introducing new command structures that can respond to rapidly shifting scenarios. What once might have been the domain of science fiction is now being built into the operating frameworks of the largest naval force on Earth. The recalibration also draws into sharper focus the question of surveillance and detection. If 3I Atlas is accelerating or otherwise manifesting earlier, it compels militaries to ask whether their sensors and systems are adequate. The Navy's acknowledgement of this timeline shift suggests that it has either identified anomalies that confirm the acceleration, or that its predictive models have been updated with fresh insights. Yet it also raises the possibility that there are gaps, places where humanity's technological reach may not be sufficient to track or comprehend what is occurring. This recognition drives a frenzy of development as engineers and scientists scramble to enhance satellite arrays, deep-sea listening posts, and airborne detection platforms in order to close the gap between what is happening and what can be measured. In political circles, the Navy's announcement transforms strategic debates. Legislators and policymakers are no longer dealing with theoretical scenarios. They must now respond to an immediate shift that demands resources and decisions without delay. Debates in congressional committees and international councils will likely take on a more urgent tone, as leaders recognize that they are being judged not on long-term foresight, but on near-term readiness. Budgets, which often moves slowly through bureaucratic channels, will be redirected under emergency authorizations. Programs that once competed for attention with domestic concerns will now be prioritized with a singular urgency. This acceleration reshapes political agendas in ways that cannot be ignored. The earlier arrival of 3I Atlas also forces governments to confront the delicate question of public communication. How much should be revealed, and how quickly? The Navy's internal recalibration may not have been meant for public consumption, yet its implications inevitably seep into the broader conversation. Citizens are not oblivious to shifts in tone, and when military branches begin preparing more visibly, people take notice. Governments must then walk a fine line between honesty and restraint, providing enough information to maintain credibility while avoiding the risk of destabilization. The earlier timeline raises the stakes of this communication strategy, leaving less room for error in managing public perception. At the scientific level, the acceleration intensifies a sense of urgency to develop interpretive frameworks. If 3I Atlas is approaching sooner, researchers must compress decades of work into years, years into months. Hypotheses must be tested, models validated, and peer-reviewed cautions set aside in favor of rapid iteration. Collaboration across disciplines becomes essential, as astrophysicists, mathematicians, engineers, and even philosophers are forced into the same rooms, tasked with developing insights that can guide governments and militaries in the face of the unknown. The scientific process itself is transformed, no longer paced by conferences and journals, but by the drumbeat of impending arrival. The cultural impact is equally profound. Stories of contact, arrival, and vast entities have long lived in the realm of myth and art, but now they begin to resonate with a new weight. Film, literature, and media that once entertained audiences with speculation now serve as unintentional rehearsals for what the Navy is suggesting could happen in real time. The sense of imminence infuses daily life with a surreal texture. People imagine what the skyline might look like when 3I Atlas manifests, or what their routines will become under the shadow of its presence. The Navy's recalibration thus ignites the imagination of millions, shaping conversations in cafes, classrooms, and boardrooms around the world. Economically, the implications of earlier arrival are immense. Markets, always sensitive to uncertainty, begin to price in the risks of disruption. Industries tied to aerospace, defense, and communications experience surges of investment, while sectors dependent on stability may suffer shocks. The prospect of imminent arrival reshapes economic forecasting, as companies reconsider long-term projects in light of potentially transformative events. The acceleration of timelines forces CEOs and boards of directors to weigh not just quarterly profits, but the resilience of their industries in the face of something unprecedented. Diplomatically, the recalibration challenges the fabric of alliances and international organizations. NATO, the United Nations, and other multilateral bodies are suddenly confronted with questions that transcend their charters. How does a collective of nations prepare for something that may not fit into the categories of aggression, conflict, or treaty violation? The Navy's announcement compels these institutions to stretch their frameworks, to prepare not only for war or peace, but for an encounter with the undefined. In doing so, they must forge new forms of cooperation, breaking through bureaucratic inertia with the recognition that time is no longer abundant. For the military personnel closest to the situation, the acceleration changes the tempo of life aboard ships, in command centers, and at forward-deployed bases. Every drill, every briefing, every patrol takes on heightened meaning. The sense of being on the edge of something historic transforms the mundane into the extraordinary. Sailors, pilots, and analysts recognize that their actions may soon intersect with a phenomenon beyond their training, and that recognition fuels both pride and apprehension. The recalibration brings with it a new intensity, a sharpening of focus, and a weight that presses on every decision. At a deeper philosophical level, the acceleration raises questions about human preparedness. If 3I Atlas is arriving sooner, does it reflect a lack of human foresight, or does it reveal the inherent limits of human prediction? The recognition that events can outpace expectations forces a humbling acknowledgement that humanity is not always the author of its own timelines. This realization reverberates through religious institutions, ethical debates, and personal reflections as individuals and communities grapple with the idea of confronting something vast with limited preparation. The Navy's recalibration also invites speculation about intent. If 3I Atlas is not simply a natural phenomenon, but an entity with agency, its earlier arrival could be interpreted as deliberate. This possibility introduces new layers of complexity to military and diplomatic planning. If the acceleration is intentional, it suggests awareness, perhaps even communication. Such an interpretation forces strategists to consider not only defense and detection, but also dialogue. The Navy's announcement becomes not only a matter of preparing for arrival, but of preparing for the possibility of engagement. The acceleration of timelines also sharpens the contrast between secrecy and disclosure within the intelligence community. Agencies tasked with monitoring 3I Atlas now face pressure to release information more quickly, to share insights across branches and borders. The earlier arrival leaves less time for compartmentalization, compelling agencies that once guarded their data jealously to collaborate more openly. This shift reshapes the intelligence ecosystem, creating both opportunities for breakthroughs and risks of exposure. For the broader global population, the Navy's recalibration becomes a lens through which to interpret daily events. Unusual weather patterns, communication disruptions, or unexplained sightings are all reframed in the context of earlier arrival. The imagination fills in gaps, sometimes with accuracy, sometimes with fear. The sense that the extraordinary is no longer distant but imminent changes the way people live their lives, altering priorities, relationships, and even dreams. The Navy may not intend to reshape civilian psychology, but its message inevitably does so. Religious communities in particular find themselves grappling with the acceleration. Doctrines and prophecies are reinterpreted in light of the new timeline, with some seeing confirmation of their beliefs, and others struggling to reconcile tradition with unfolding reality. The Navy's recalibration thus ripples into sermons, prayers, and rituals, transforming religious life into a dialogue with the unknown. For many, the acceleration does not just demand readiness of the body and the mind, but readiness of the spirit. The media, always eager for narratives of urgency, seizes on the Navy's announcement as a turning point. Headlines proclaim imminent arrival, debates rage across networks, and speculation fills the airwaves. The recalibration becomes not only a military assessment, but a cultural event, shaping how societies perceive their place in history. Journalists and commentators amplify the sense of imminence, ensuring that the acceleration becomes embedded in the consciousness of the public. The Navy's recalibration also challenges educational systems. Schools and universities, long structured around stable curricula, are now confronted with the need to prepare students for a world on the cusp of transformation. Professors in physics, history, and philosophy find their lectures infused with new urgency, while students demand answers that bridge the gap between theory and unfolding reality. The earlier arrival of 3I Atlas reshapes not only what is taught, but how it is taught, as education itself becomes preparation for an unprecedented encounter. The implications extend even into the realm of personal identity. As the horizon of arrival draws nearer, individuals begin to reconsider who they are and what matters to them. Careers, ambitions, and relationships are reframed in light of the possibility that humanity stands on the threshold of contact with something vast. The Navy's recalibration thus cascades into the most intimate spheres of life, reminding people that their personal stories are now intertwined with a larger unfolding narrative. In the corridors of power, the recalibration heightens the pressure on leaders to make choices without the luxury of hindsight. Every allocation of resources, every decision about disclosure, every directive to the military carries weight magnified by the accelerated timeline. Leaders are judged not by their ability to maintain stability, but by their ability to navigate transformation. The Navy's recalibration becomes both a warning and a test, revealing which leaders are capable of responding to history as it accelerates toward them. Even the arts are transformed. Musicians, painters, writers, and filmmakers respond to the sense of imminence by creating works that attempt to capture the magnitude of what is unfolding. The acceleration of 3I Atlas's arrival infuses their creations with urgency, ensuring that culture itself becomes a record of humanity's anticipation. The Navy's announcement thus does more than reshape strategy and science. It fuels the creative spirit, providing raw material for expressions of awe, fear, and wonder. The earlier arrival also amplifies ethical debates. If humanity must respond to 3I Atlas sooner than expected, What principles should guide that response? Should defense take precedence over dialogue? Should secrecy override transparency? Should national interests outweigh global cooperation? These questions, once theoretical, now demand immediate answers. The Navy's recalibration forces ethicists, policymakers, and citizens alike to confront dilemmas that cannot be postponed. At the frontier of technology, the acceleration compels innovation at a pace rarely seen outside wartime. Laboratories that once worked on incremental advances are now driven by the pressure of imminent need. Breakthroughs in propulsion, communication, and energy are pursued with intensity as humanity seeks to equip itself for whatever encounter may come. The Navy's recalibration acts as a catalyst, igniting a technological surge that could reshape civilization regardless of the outcome of arrival. If you like this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Also, leave your comments below and tell us, what are your thoughts on the US Navy's belief 3I Atlas may arrive earlier? We want to hear from you. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.